As we're assessing scour, we need to assign that upstream location, call it an approach section, where we have to assign this cross section and utilize that hydraulic information to make these decisions on whether or not that flow is transporting sediment. And so in this example you see here, there's actually a main bridge represented by the black arc, and then also a relief bridge represented by the white arc. And then in both cases, upstream to the left, the other arc represents the approach arc. And it's important consideration to make sure that approach is placed far enough upstream that it represents the flow basically in the channel before it has been impacted by the encroachment from the roadway embankments.
Hello and welcome to today's webinar covering advances in scour assessment. I'm your host, Cray Price with the International Water Training Institute, and on behalf of the Australian Water School, we want to thank you, our global audience of almost 1,000 attendees today, for joining us. We have got a lot of content to cover, and we want to make this interactive, give you all a chance to ask questions of the experts who are with us today. So with that, let's bring our presenters on. We've got Scott, Casey, Carlos, and Stanford. If you could just let us know where you're joining us from today and how long you've been involved in this dirty job. So essentially we're dealing with dirt and how water moves it. How long have you been doing what you do?
Thanks, Craig. Thanks for inviting me to join today. I have been computing scour, I'm thinking through this, upwards of 30 years. I've been with the Federal Highway Administration for about 18 and consulting prior to that.
Perfect. Casey, let's hear from you.
Hey everybody, Casey Kramer from Olympia, Washington, and I've been working in hydraulics, sediment transport, and scour for over 20 years now.
All right, Casey's been with us on a few previous webinars, as has Carlos. So Scott's his first time joining us today, but Carlos, over to you. Let's hear an introduction.
Hi, Carlos Gonzalez. I'm from SMEC in Brisbane, in Queensland, Australia, and I've been doing hydraulics and scour computations about 20 years, formerly Queensland Department of Transport and Main Roads. So we have conducted a lot of scour modeling for bridges.
Perfect. All right, Stanford, also another frequent flyer with us today. Give us a quick introduction.
Hey, I'm Stanford Gibson. I work for the Hydrologic Engineering Center with the Corps of Engineers in Davis, California. I'm the sediment guy on the HEC-RAS team. And like Casey and Carlos and short of Scott, I've been doing this for about 20 years.
Okay, well, we'll get everybody to join us again in the order that you saw there. I'm going to put a little bit of an Australian perspective. Being the Australian Water School, let's show a quick example of an Australian bridge which had some issues with scour. So when we look up here at the half of Australia here, the Western Australia joins up to the Northern Territory up here. The only sealed route, the only paved route between Western Australia and the Northern Territory crosses the Fitzroy River here at Fitzroy Crossing. And so what you'll see here, though, is this is an old drawing where people went and gauged this this roadway. There is a river here, but the floodplain is 13 kilometers long. So we do have a bit of a constriction here, but trying to estimate what's going to happen at the bridge is a bit tough. And, you know, have a look at what's going on here and what kind of scour you might get, even just from shallow flows. So imagine then what happens as we get deeper flows. This is the bridge. Did a bit of an erosion study here about 10, 12 years ago and walked up into this bridge and wow, that seems high. And so before the event, this is what it looks like. A little bit of a concern as I'm looking at this riprap, seeing the energy of the water heading right toward it. And here is an event about a year ago, a little over a year ago, that basically overtopped the bridge and the roadway as you went along. And typical Australian fashion here, you can see how that looks during the event. And let's wait and see what happens as that high water recedes. And here it is after the event. So we're talking about scour today. This was an extreme example of scour. Very hard to even figure out how much flow was going on because the gauges got wiped out in this event. You can see what's left over of the structure here. And, you know, as the water and the energy talk. We'll talk about pier scour, have a look at those piers there. We'll talk about the constriction, contractions, and what's going on hydraulically. Quite a mess, and luckily they were able to go back in and very quickly, in record time and ahead of schedule, get this repaired. Imagine the job that it took to do this. And so I'll give you some additional resources on this particular project as we go forward. But again, just have a look at what happens here in an aerial photo and imagine the hydraulic forces involved to shift a riverbank basically from right here to right here, and over 100 meters of a shift in that location there. So the bank migration, can be an issue, but we're going to be talking specifically today about bridge scour. So as a quick overview of some of the resources, if you go to hydroschool.org/scour, we'll keep this website updated live with any additional documents that come around. And we wanted to refer you to some of the previous webinars that Carlos and Stanford and Casey have been involved in, including an introduction to bridge scour. We're going to get a little more advanced today. Do go back and watch this one. That one's free. We do have an upcoming course that we'll give you some links to at the end in June, where we'll give you some examples to try this on yourself. We also have the Federal Highways Hydraulic Toolbox links here, hydraulic engineering circulars. We have Austro's manuals for the Australian group. We also have, here's a paper that refers back to that Fitzroy River crossing bridge failure and replacement, and then some papers that Casey Kramer has done. Also, if you're going to do this in 3D, thanks to AI for this little rock scour image here, come join us again for an upcoming course and webinar about doing this in CFD. And then we have plenty of resources on scour countermeasures. Today we'll talk about how to predict the actual scour going on. But if you want to prevent that scour, then we've got additional resources here and a whole bunch of them that you can have a look at here from our previous webinars and some other papers. So that is a quick overview of some of the resources available to you and why we are doing what we do, how significant it is, and how dangerous it can be. That's why I showed that picture of the bridge failure, knocked out this really essential corridor for almost 6 months. And very important to make sure that we get our estimates right and that we are preparing for a future that involves drastically higher extreme flows than we might have been experiencing in the past, and along with that, potentially some increased scour effects. So with that, let's have our panelists are going to be answering your questions in the background. I'm going to turn over to Casey. If you can start sharing your screen, Casey, and then we will answer your questions in the background. And then Casey's going to kind of tag team with Scott. And as one answers questions, the other will be doing the presentation. So I can see your screen just fine there. So I'll back off into the background here. We'll turn it over to Casey, and we'll hear from everybody else shortly.
Excellent. Thanks, Craig. So Scott and I will be presenting some introductory topics here for the upcoming interactive Bridge Scour Essentials workshop, and also providing a summary for some of the advancements in bridge scour assessments. So just as a more thorough overview, here's some things we'll be covering, starting with various resources for bridge scour analysis, kind of what Craig had presented there, through the discussion that Scott will be going over some of the tools available for consistent ways in computing bridge scour. Just to touch real quick, here's a variety of resources that Craig actually covered available for conducting bridge scour analyses. One thing though, you may notice some of these resources are a bit outdated. From the United States, the Federal Highway Administration is actually currently underway in updating HEC-18. You can see there last time it was updated was in 2012. They're also working on updating HEC-20. HEC-23, which is the scour countermeasure aspect, that is actually nearing completion. And also HDS-7, the hydraulic design of safe bridges, which is also nearing completion and will likely be out later this year. I guess I would welcome, we would be interested if you do utilize other resources that other than what's mentioned here on this slide. If you could enter in the chat pod, that would be great. Also available, the FHWA Bridge Scour Workshop and some WSDOT Scour training are some great resources available as well. And we'll be utilizing those in this upcoming Bridge Scour Essentials Workshop. So actually, Cray's photos were excellent. This slide right here is identifying the three main components when we are talking about total scour, namely long-term degradation, contraction scour, and local scour. This graphic here, though, is a system without the potential for lateral migration. So that slide that Cray had shown, we'll be looking at here in a little bit. But this is for one where you can go through and assess, working collaboratively with your geomorphologist, and you have that certainty that the channel is not able to migrate. Obviously, there's several items we could discuss with this graphic. However, the important takeaway is that when you do analyze your system and you identify that there is no potential to laterally migrate, the thalweg, or the lowest elevation within the channel, is typically not used as the reference elevation for all the bridge components when you're going through and you're determining total scour at each component. And so in this graphic, you can see on the right-hand side where there is that anticipated abutment scour over here on the right. You can notice here that the scour elevation is referenced from the existing ground elevation and not the thalweg elevation. And this is much different than the photo that Cray had shown there when you are in a system that can laterally migrate, which is shown here in this graphic. So similar to the last graphic, this one has those three main components for determining total scour. You have long-term degradation, contraction scour, and local scour. However, this is for that system that does have that potential to laterally migrate, which you can see here on the graphic with these arrows. So it's been determined, working with your geomorphologist or looking at successive aerials over time, that you've determined that your channel can occupy all locations within the bridge opening. And the important takeaway from this graphic is that when you do identify a system that does have that potential to laterally migrate, the thalweg, or the lowest elevation within the channel, is actually what's utilized as that reference elevation for determining total scour at all your bridge components. And so similarly, or different in this graphic, if we're looking here on the right-hand side in this graphic, you can see this abutment scour occurring here on the right-hand side. Rather than it being referenced down from the existing ground, it's actually referenced from the thalweg elevation, just with that ability of this channel to be able to shift over time, or during the design life or service life of your bridge. So advancements in 2D hydraulic modeling, we thought that this was really important to touch on because the hydrology, the geomorphology, and the hydraulics, that's everything that you need to do, the prerequisite before you dive into your scour analysis. So this table we compiled, as in the United States, there is still a transition going from one-dimensional to two-dimensional hydraulic modeling. And as can be seen in the table, as I'm sure you are aware, the use of 1D models requires a lot of assumptions by the user, which is shown here in the table. And so with those advancements that you can get out of utilizing 2D or 3D hydraulic models, there is definitely a reduction in a lot of the assumptions that are required by the user. And ultimately, that provides more accurate results that then can feed into doing your scour analysis. Another thing really important to note here that's related is that while scour equations have largely not changed for quite some time, actually, the results and the less assumptions that you can attain out of a 2D hydraulic model have really advanced, and typically they provide more accurate estimates of bridge scour in addition to better estimates of hydraulics. So they're definitely coupled there. So we have folks from all around the world here. I think it's important to acknowledge that there is a variety of 2D hydraulic models available around the world, and there continues to be advancements in their capabilities, which is excellent. And with that variety of 2D models available, I think ultimately it's really prudent to identify first, what is the purpose of your 2D modeling project? In this case, looking at scour. And then ultimately select a 2D model that will be able to provide the output necessary to support your modeling purpose. So again, for bridge scour assessments, the Federal Highway Administration and a lot of state DOTs within the United States utilize the 2D model SRH2D developed by the Bureau of Reclamation. This model has had continued advancements along with other 2D models around the world. But some of the advancements with SRH2D includes being able to model pressure flow in the 2D domain, visualizing 3D structures, which you can see here on this graphic, and automated meshing techniques, along with some other advancements that are continually taking place. I guess a deeper dive into some of the references, for those that have seen the FHWA two-dimensional hydraulic modeling for highways in the river environment, This is actually a fairly recent release, NCHRP report 1077, which is selection and application of Manning's roughness values in two-dimensional hydraulic models. Definitely recommend you review. They contain a lot of good practices or best practices for 2D hydraulic model development, and will assist in conducting your bridge scour assessments. The NCHRP report 1077 is the first document that we're aware of in the US anyway, for selection and application of Manning roughness values for 2D models. And it also includes a nice section on some best practices for 2D modeling. So for bridge scour, this slide may look familiar. So for bridge scour analyses, we ultimately are interested in determining what we call the worst case scour condition. And that may be within a range of flow events and scenarios. And so for these reasons, when you are developing your model, looking at multiple flow events and scenarios has to be considered. And it's important to note that worst case scour does not always occur at the highest flow, such as the 100-year or the 500-year flood event, which has been done a lot in the past and historically. For example, if your bridge is located upstream and within the influence of a reservoir, you may have worst case scour at a lower flow when that reservoir is drawn down than a high flow event when the reservoir may be at full pool. Or for pier scour, as another example, you may have a more severe angle of attack at a lower flow event than you would during a valley spanning flood event. So these types of things are really important to understand in looking at worst case scour. Ostroads uses terms such as the scour design event and the extreme flood event, whereas Federal Highways and AASHTO use terms scour design flood and scour check flood. But ultimately, within these three documents or agencies that are looking at providing scour recommendations, they all use that concept of worst case scour. So actually, as mentioned in the previous slides, this is just another example. This is a bridge scour analysis where we're interested in identifying, again, that worst case scour that could occur at the bridge over the service and design life, for the applicable standards that you'll be utilizing. And this example shown here represents a condition just prior to roadway overtopping, which you can see here, got flow going from left to right. Here's your road, here's your bridge openings. And so you can see here that, in this case, the worst case scour often occurs just before that roadway embankment starts to overtop, right? Because without that roadway embankment overtopping, all that flow is being forced and contracted through your bridge openings. And so a lot of times that's what's producing the worst case scour. In the bullets here too, you can see that, this is another example illustrating why it's so important to assess a variety of flows and a variety of scenarios to ultimately determine that worst case scour. And with that, I'm going to hand it off to Scott, who's going to talk about some key considerations for bridge scour assessments. Scott?
All right. Great, Casey. Yeah, I'll give you an overview of some of the key considerations with regards to computing scour. And then also share some of the common pitfalls that we've seen for folks computing scour. And then as far as advancements go with regards to 2D modeling, I'll then give an introduction, if you will, to our bridge scour tool and our hydraulic toolbox scour calculator. So starting here with a few key considerations, really, anytime I've reviewed a scour analysis, I always ask for the 2D hydraulic model. It's very important to go back and review the model. And as Casey said, different models are developed for different applications and objectives. And we certainly want to make sure that the hydraulic model resolution and detail is sufficient for computing scour. Certainly a more highly refined 2D model is going to be better at predicting flow splits that might go to a main structure versus a relief structure. And that's very important for computing scour. And then also, as Casey was alluding to, we want to make sure that the hydraulic model has scenarios run that might, or hopefully, capture what we're considering a worst case event. And so really want to make sure that those hydraulic models results are available. And then with respect to bed material gradation and sample locations, this becomes very important when we make decisions with regards to scour. And so just real quickly, we want to have bed material samples at the approach section, which is upstream of the bridge, kind of outside of the influence of the bridge, that represents the material that may be or could be transported to the bridge. And then it's also beneficial to have bed material samples at the bridge location specifically. And even where we're going with our future research, it's of interest to not just have bed material samples of the top layer of material, but also a good idea of the stratification and the characteristics of the sublayers. That's something we'll get into in more detailed training later on, not in this webinar. Also, as it's important to understand the potential for long-term degradation. That's often overlooked. People don't know what it is, and so they just disregard it. And as Casey alluded to, it's important to understand stream stability and the potential for the main channel to migrate across the bridge opening over the life of the bridge. It's also very important to know how to extract the correct hydraulic variables for computing scour. I've seen a lot of folks in trying to mouse over values and extract maximum values upstream of the bridge and through the bridge. That's not appropriate. It's important to utilize averaged hydraulic values, and I'll get into that a little bit more later on. And then the last bullet here, it's important to understand the concept of live bed versus clear water scour. In a nutshell, we need to know if material upstream of the bridge is being transported through the bridge section, which will essentially help mitigate the scour potential. And so we evaluate that, the potential to move material upstream. And then as we're assessing scour, we need to assign that upstream location, call it an approach section, where we have to just assign this cross section and utilize that hydraulic information to make these decisions on whether or not that flow is transporting sediment. And so in this example you see here, there's actually a main bridge represented by the black arc, and then also a relief bridge represented by the white arc. And then in both cases, upstream to the left, the other arc represents the approach arc. And it's important consideration to make sure that approach is placed far enough upstream that it represents the flow basically in the channel before it has been impacted by the encroachment from the roadway embankments. 2D modeling is very helpful to assess that location. You can review the velocity vectors, and at the point you start seeing those velocity vectors turn towards the main channel, you know that you need to locate that approach section just upstream of that. Also, just a key note here with respect to the approach section, it's important not to locate that in any areas where you might have a local high velocity area, because that may ultimately result in overestimating the amount of sediment that's being transported to the bridge, and then ends up underestimating the scour potential. So an important consideration there. Go ahead, Casey, next slide. A couple other key considerations specifically with respect to pier scour and abutment scour. It's very important to understand or know all of the pier dimensions, the orientation of the pier, and even whether or not there's any pier footings or foundation that may be exposed to the flow, and also the angle of attack. Things such as, pier column diameter and spacing of piers all come into play and are very important in computing pier scour. Another thing that's it's very important is where you extract that velocity and depth for computing pier scour. I'll show you a graphic in the next slide, but I've seen folks, many practitioners extracting velocity and depth from between piers where maybe more maximum values occur, but that would be incorrect. The original research uses the approach velocity and depth. So again, those are key consideration and important things to consider. Also, as engineers, we tend to think about things as being fixed. And so we do our 2D modeling on this fixed bed geometry, when in reality, over the life of the bridge, that channel certainly could have the potential to migrate across the entire bridge opening. And so with regards to piers and abutments, we have to have an understanding or an assessment of that on how that could impact our pier scour calculations at each of the piers. And for abutment scour, probably the most important thing for abutments is to consider where those abutments are relative to the main channel. And in recent years, Federal Highways has Federal Highway Administration has recommended the third method of abutment scour that's currently presented in HEC 18. It's referred to the NCHRP method. The Hire and Froelich method, I answered a question previously. We will be archiving those methods. They're not wrong, but we have found that the NCHRP method is more recent research and more representative. And so with that method, you need to assess what it refers to as either a scour condition A, where it uses main channel hydraulic conditions, average main channel parameters, if you will, to compute scour, or a condition B, whereas it's an abutment that's set back from the main channel and will not be in contact with the main channel over the life of the bridge. And that computation uses overbank hydraulic parameters. Okay, so that's a really important consideration when computing abutment scour. Then the last point here, it's very important to bring your interdisciplinary team together and discuss your results with your geotechnical engineers, your scour, your structural engineers, probably the roadway engineers with respect to the layout. And in most cases, this is an iterative process. Primarily, you might come into a situation where your scour values are quite high and your structures guys don't like that. It may be appropriate within the constraints to maybe lengthen the bridge one span, reevaluate scour, and see if that comes up with a better solution. And there's probably a number of things. You could look at pier shape and pier alignment, things like that, that could be modified to reduce scour. And that's a very important part of this process. All right, as I mentioned, identifying where velocity and depth is used for computing pier scour. There's two real key points here. Is if you're doing more of a forensic analysis and you want to compare a measured scour to a computed scour, we recommend, using velocity and depth upstream or approaching that pier. So just above or upstream of that influence of that pier. But for design purposes, Federal Highway Administration recommends actually using the velocity and depth at the location of the maximum unit discharge across the width of the channel upstream of the bridge. And really what that's just doing, it's accounting for that possible migration of the thowig or even the channel across that bridge. And if it's a narrower opening, you might apply that over all of the piers. If it's a very wide opening, then you need to make that assessment as an engineer as to if the channel can't migrate all the way into all the piers, how far might it migrate? And so that's a key consideration. So next slide, please, Casey. All right, and so now I've got a couple slides here with lists of a number of common pitfalls we've seen in folks computing scour. And I can say I've been guilty of these in the past, so I'm not trying to shame anyone, but these are really just to raise your attention on best practices, if you will. So the first one here I commented on earlier. I would never get into a scour review without first looking at the hydraulic modeling results. You just never want to assume that they're good, everything was done correctly. So that's kind of a no-brainer. You want to always review the hydraulics when reviewing a scour. So the second point, missing the worst case scour condition. It's not necessarily missing it. It's maybe, well, I guess it is missing it, but it's really having such a narrow focus. Maybe only modeling, say, the 100-year event as opposed to the 100 and the 500-year or multiple events. Another event that's often very important, it could be a controlling factor, is just that point where it's just about to overtop the approaches, but at that point, flow is seeing the greatest contraction and going through the bridge opening. And so I like to see at least that incipient overtopping event, Q100 to maybe Q500, and then really depends on the project. There may be another hydraulic condition that could govern. So it's good to at least see that the practitioner has considered trying to bracket that worst case condition. Also, as I showed you earlier, the location of that approach section is very important for computing contraction scour. Too many cases where I've seen that approach section located almost immediately upstream of the bridge, really close to the bridge. And in that case, you're not representing that flow really approaching. And so you're going to be representing an area of higher velocity. it's going to predict a higher delivery of sediment to the bridge, and it's ultimately going to result in under-computing contraction scour for a live bed condition. So again, you're just not representing the original research correctly. The fourth point here, incorrectly defining the width of flow transporting sediment. This refers to defining the channel bank stations at that approach section. And one thing I did not mention earlier is that when we specify that approach section, we have to define or differentiate the main channel from the overbanks. And oftentimes, we recommend, I should say, using a TOA slope width, which is most representative of that, the part of the channel that can transport sediment. Many use a top of bank to top of bank width, which is okay. The key factor here is whatever reference you use the same approach at the contracted section. Okay. And so there's all kinds of different values I've seen folks use, anywhere from the entire flow width on the approach section. Probably most misused is folks, practitioners use the bridge opening width rather than the channel width at the contracted section when computing scour. So again, there's various combinations of errors that I've seen there. I mentioned live bed versus clear water scour. It is, again, important to understand this concept. If the channel material approaching the bridge, so at the approach section upstream, is determined to be mobile, then we assume a live bed condition. And that's what we'll use to compute contraction scour. We also recommend always computing clear water scour. And in most cases, if it's live bed, that will be the governing. It'll be the lesser scour, because when material is being delivered to the bridge, it's actually mitigating that potential scour depth. But there are cases where the contracted section maybe has armored and it's larger bed material than the approach. And that could be a case where you might see a clear water scour condition. Also, I guess I want to mention that this differentiation between live bed and clear water can be different at different flow levels. I've seen folks make the assumption that if they computed a live bed case for the 100-year, that's also true for the whole range of flows, but that's not the case. It could be a clear water condition at lower flows and a live bed at higher flows. Okay, Casey, next slide, please. A few more here, couple things. I want to note this one, this misapplication of tributary inflow upstream of a bridge. Our current contraction scour equation for live bed was developed by Larson many years ago. It is based on the main channel flow and its ability to transport sediment. If you have a tributary coming in immediately upstream of the bridge and you just add flow to the main channel and do those calculations, that's incorrect. In fact, we don't have a good method for computing contraction scour with our standard methods in HEC-18 for those kind of complex scenarios. We might be able to make some assumptions on the sediment load, but probably for those challenging scenarios, it'd be more appropriate actually to do a sediment transport model. Okay. But I've seen this applied in numerous occasions where there's sediment loads coming from two different sources. And again, we cannot, or we should not be using our the Larson's equation in HEC-18 for live bed contraction scour. Another one I've seen, this has probably been most frequent. I've been reviewing scour analyses, say like with HEC-RAS 2D, when folks don't have a scour tool, and this is part of the reason we added the scour tool to SMS and SRH 2D, is that they would mouse over the values and use the maximums, both at the approach section and the contracted section. And that's not consistent with the original research. And quite honestly, it can give you values all over the place. So we certainly recommend extracting the averaged hydraulic parameters for the main channel and the overbanks. This third bullet, we've talked about this multiple times now. Certainly, I've seen too many people ignore the fact that the channel can migrate over the life of the bridge. So we have to consider that when computing scour. Scour is not occurring in a fixed location. So we have to definitely give that some thought. The fourth bullet here, this using insufficient or inaccurate gradation information. Unfortunately, here in the States, I think I want to say it comes down to laziness. But there are several states that actually just assume a minimum of D50 of 0.2 millimeters and compute scour. And I think in many of those cases, they're just missing the mark. And so I really recommend strongly going out into the field and collecting appropriate data to get a representative gradation of the channel that's upstream of the bed, as well as at the contracted section. That will really improve the accuracy of your scour calculations. And then this last point here, incorrectly interpreting scour depths to elevations. This primarily applies to abutment scour. And so without getting into it too much, when you compute an abutment scour depth, it is specific to the location that you pick for that computation. And you just have to be very careful in converting that to an elevation. So I could go deeper into that one. That's probably for further training. So Casey, next slide, please. All right, I just want to introduce this bridge scour tool in SMS and our hydraulic toolbox. As you can see that some of these calculations get fairly involved. And I didn't even mention the fact that when the bridge is skewed or the piers are skewed, all of those corrections, if you will, have to be accounted for to compute the correct width of flow. And so that can be very involved. And we've seen many struggle with it. And beyond that, when we ask states to compute scour for multiple flows, you can see that gets very involved. And so through this process of migrating to 2D modeling, we've also added a bridge scour tool to this SMS graphical interface for SRH2D. And it basically automates all of the extraction of hydraulic parameters from the 2D results, and then extracts those into our FHWA hydraulic toolbox that has all of the HEC-18 scour equations programmed into it. So Casey, you can go to the next slide. I've got a few more details here. So quickly, overview of steps. We create a specific bridge scour coverage in SMS. We define arcs to represent the approach section, the contracted section. I'll show this in the next slide. We get into the details, so I won't go into it here. But then ultimately, once we've defined that, we've run the hydraulic model, we then can compute and export all the parameters in the toolbox. So let me show you an example of that. So here's an example. You can see the arcs on the left for the approach section. And then along that approach arc, the user has to define two bank station arcs, as I said before, preferably representing the toe slope to toe slope. And then on the right, you can see the red arc at the contracted section. And you do the same thing. You define the bank station, toe slope to toe slope, or top of bank to top of bank, if that's the reference you're using. In addition, the user also draws arcs to represent the location and the alignment of the piers. That's important. And then also the location of the abutment toes. Okay. And then the stream center line is also included simply for stationing. It's not as important. So the user defines those arcs, and we're also assuming that these are appropriate for all of your range of flows as far as this approach bank or approach arc location. That's an assumption, so it's certainly for the user to assess if that is appropriate or not, but we found it to be true in most cases. A little more detail in the contracted section. So I noted the pier arcs and the alignment of those is important. Again, bank arc locations, the alignment's not important. They just have to cross the contracted section arc. And then similar for the abutment toe arcs. One thing I did not mention is that for each of the pier arcs and abutment arcs, when you select on those attributes, that's where you can add the pier width, the pier shape, pier length, if there's anything else I'm missing. It carries that information over into the hydraulic toolbox. So it requires no additional user entry once you're in the hydraulic toolbox. And then just a quick overview of what that menu looks like in SMS. There's a couple things starting at the top. The gradations for each at the approach section and contracted section are entered in this interface, as well as you select each of the simulations that have been run with results. So this assumes you've already run the simulations, reviewed the results, and everything looks good. Then you have, again, we've included all the pier arc attributes, abutment arc attributes. SMS has a 3D bridge generator in it. It will use that to extract the cross section. There's some more details here I don't need to get into, but I do want to point out those view values on the right. Before you export to the hydraulic toolbox, you can view values, and then you can actually copy all those values to another spreadsheet if you wish, if you have another way to compute Scour or check Scour. So, but ultimately at the bottom of this menu, you export values to the hydraulic toolbox, and you can launch the hydraulic toolbox from here and then review results. Little overview of the export. I want to highlight a couple things. So again, it is computing averaged hydraulic parameters at these locations for the main channel and the overbanks. It by default is using the velocity and depth at that maximum unit discharge. And so that's for design purposes. The user can go in and change those back to the local values. They are also provided. Pressure flow parameters are also exported. The bridge section and pier geometry, all the skew adjustments are done automatically. And then also I mentioned the bridge deck and pier geometry if selected are included in the geometry. They can also be entered by the user in the toolbox if needed. Once you get to the toolbox, I really want to highlight that although this is automated, we don't want it to be a black box. It's important to review everything. For the design angle of attack, I want to highlight this. It by default will enter the angle of attack that's measured in the 2D model. But for considering the opportunity for approach channel to migrate, for design purposes, you may want to or likely should change that design angle of attack. Okay. And then as I think I mentioned this earlier, long-term degradation is not included in calculations in SMS, so that has to be assessed manually. And we recommend you looking at HEC-20 for that. I'll wrap up here soon. Just I want to give you graphics to show that the hydraulic toolbox will summarize all the information by scour component and give you a total scour elevation and give you a bridge scour plot as shown on the right, as well as your structure and water surface. This just shows one profile. It gets busy, but you can add multiples and to suit your fancy. You can change colors and all the line types. So, and that wraps us up.
All right, thanks so much for that. Carlos, you can probably already start sharing your screen. In the meantime, though, Stanford, I understand you need to run on the hour, and so we may be going a little bit over time here with our panel discussion. So I might have you just mention a couple things about HEC-RAS and where we're at with that. We talked about SRH2D, we talked about SMS, the hydraulic toolbox, but there have been a couple of questions about about HEC-RAS. So do you want to just give a brief summary of where we're at with the Scour tool? Because people sometimes go in and use it, and then we'll have you go back into the background answering some of the questions while Carlos gets on with his presentation.
Sure, great presentation. And I think that, we're talking about moving past the 5th version of the Federal Highway Manual, and the RAS HD tool is obviously on the 4th version. So it's already kind of behind, and it's going to, if we're phasing out Froelich and Higher, which is news to me, but it might be time because those are classic, let's say. Then it makes a lot of sense to phase it out. RAS has it hasn't been standard because we don't feed into the toolbox, which is standard. But a lot of the stuff that Scott was talking about has analogy with what we're doing in RAS, because we have other analyses that are kind of fundamentally based on one-dimensional theory, but you can get a better answer with averaging two-dimensional results. So like the RIPRAP tool is the approach we're taking with using two-dimensional results for the RIPRAP tool is very similar. You have to average. And I think Scott hit that point a number of times, and I just think it's really important that you can't be taking 2D point information and putting them into an analysis method that uses, cross-section average. And so, these tools sound great. And Scott and I have a meeting in a couple of weeks to talk about how to kind of bring RAS 2D into the fold and make it compliant with their toolbox.
Sounds good. All right. We look forward to that. We might have a dedicated webinar about that once you're ready to go with those. So thanks, Stanford. In the background, if you can keep answering some of those questions that are relevant to HEC-RAS. We also have a lot of two-flow users on. And Carlos, is why we've got you on here as well to give it a bit of an Australian perspective. We brought the Americans on as the Australian Water School because a lot of the ARR and Queensland manuals and even the Austros manuals eventually refer back to it. We want to make sure that we're also, like happened with some of the riprap equations, updating, and sometimes that doesn't happen in real time, that we get the updates to the Australian manuals as quickly as the updates are coming into the US manuals that they reference. So Carlos, I can see your screen just fine. Just a reminder to everybody to have a look at the questions in the background, upvote them. We'll have a panel discussion here live at the end, and mention a couple things about for those who want to do this yourself with an actual bridge, with actual hydraulic modeling results, we'll come along to that course in June. So over to you, Carlos.
Thank you, Craig. Hope everyone can hear me all right. So effectively, yeah, today I'm here to just give an Australian perspective of how we do this here in Australia, especially in Queensland. This is all based on the work that the TMR, Queensland Department of Transport and Main Roads, have done with the supplement to Austros, Chapter 5, Bridge Scour in January 2019. This document effectively has been cross-referenced to Austros 2018. The current edition is just really a minor update with some errata, yeah. And what I want to really talk about is, you know, how we do it here in Australia, and this is all published, freely available, so you can actually go and see. That also has an example that you know, kind of shows you how to do it, right? So one of the most important things, and that has been mentioned already by Scott and Stanford, is that we actually need to do a multidisciplinary approach. It's not just a hydraulic engineering job. It has to be structural, geotechnical, and hydraulic engineering combined. Yeah, and also, this might sound repetitive, but for general or natural scour assessments, you might need a specialist input from a river geomorphologist. So that's what we are recommending. So if you go and have a look at this this document, you will also see that this actually cross-correlated to nomenclature used for bridge design. Yeah, so you try to not use anymore the 1 in 100, 1 in 500, etc. We actually link it to this bridge nomenclature to actually talk to the bridge engineer. So we use SLS, serviceability limited states, and ultimate limited states, right? Based on the Australian bridge design standards. We definitely do recommend the use of 2D models on all but simplest bridge crossings. And you know, I'm not going to reiterate that. There's many advantages that are to be have from using actually 2D models, however you call them. The other thing that we actually use is actually try to use the geotechnical information to try to infer your bring it into your analysis, and not just try to assume as less things as possible. If you have best information, is better. So the first thing that we recommend is to actually do a first screening of the situation. So is there evidence of a previous scour at the bridge? Is the stream very steep? Do we have high velocity, etc.? What kind of substructure are we talking about? So that's what we do. And then we can then see if the risk, if the bridge is actually low risk or high risk, right? So low risk, so effectively is for bridges outside of floodplain or founded on erosion resistant materials, rock or any other materials. For that, you know, you will definitely need the input of a geotechnical engineer. RPEQ is like the certification in Queensland. So you need a geotechnical engineer to tell you, yeah, this material is unlikely to scour. If you do not, your founding material, but you will have to do a detailed scour assessment right away. And then, you know, they already talk about that. A total scour is actually general scour plus contraction scour plus local scour, right? So the way that we do it, so for general scour, well, it's really a specialist topic. Yeah, and in most cases, especially in Queensland and Northern Australia, as you saw in Craig's pictures, this is not simple. This is very complex. So you actually need a specialist input, right? In the manual that we presented, there's some quantitative methods, but definitely not exhaustive, right? So where I guess where the innovation comes is effectively from the contraction abutment scour that, as previously mentioned, has always been traditionally treated independently. Yeah, there's one methodology for contraction, one methodology for abutment, but NCHRP already mentioned he has actually combined both. So this is in our opinion and in our experience, this is the most comprehensive method that is recommended to do. Right. So another thing that I will emphasize is what we do recommend the use of 2D models. Why? Because it actually gives you idea of contraction, of how the flow contracts in your cross section, how the flow splits in different floodplains, etc. So another thing that is important to know is that you also need to consider if your material is cohesive or non-cohesive, right? Or if you have erodible rock. So obviously, this work is actually based on mostly American research done by NCHRP. So it has been taken on board, and yeah, that's how we use it here. So, however, I would like to talk about pressure flow vertical contraction scour. This happens when the bridge is overtopped, right? It actually happens regardless if you have lateral contraction or not, right? So if you use 1D HEC-RAS, you cannot actually calculate the pressurized flow scour. So you do need to actually take that into account as an extra, right? So there's a couple of methods, including obviously the based on HEC-18, and there's other methods based on research in New Zealand by Professor Bruce Melville. So those ones are effectively something that you can look at it to try to take into account the effect of vertical contraction scour, pressure flow scour, right? So then when we move to local scour piers, well, we recommend the use of HEC-18 equations that everyone knows, well, pretty much everyone is familiar with. Definitely, you need to know if you're in the live bed or clear water situation. There's also all the book by Professor Melville. There's a lot of the complex pier foundations from the work of the Florida Department of Transport, and once again, the cohesive materials from spherical SIFA methods from Professor Bryod at Texas A&M. So all that, effectively, what that is trying to tell you is that, well, you need to take all those considerations to form an opinion. It's not just the hydraulic analysis, right? So in the manual, there's an example, as I said, where there's a specific issue where, well, okay, there's already some questions of, how do I actually know if I'm contracting or not? So use your two-dimensional model, use your unit discharges, use your vectors, to try to come up with what is the situation. There's a lot of engineering judgment depending on a case-by-case basis. However, a dimensional model, in my opinion, will actually help you to try to determine what is your situation, right? So because of that, in Australia, this is what the method that we are recommending, right? So finally, I would say, when we talk about a multidisciplinary project, ultimately what you want to know is that your hydraulic engineer, your road engineer, your structural engineer are all in line. And what you want to produce is something like this, where you actually have your calculations, you have your technical thresholds derived by your technical engineer, you have the geometry of your bridge, you have all that information, and then based on all that, you actually form an opinion to adopt to use for design, right? So most often, if it's just a hydraulic calculation based on foliage on hire, as it has already been mentioned, but in our experience, it has been very conservative and potentially can lead to costly designs. So in summary, what I can say, in Australia, we have drawn from the American research. There's no way of denying this. Is all the research has been in America. So just giving it the Australian perspective, what we are trying to do is try to correlate with Australian TMR bridge design standards. We recommend using the 2D models. we do like the NCHRP approach a lot. Yeah, we think that vertical contraction scour is really relevant if you have an overtopping bridge. Mind you, in Australia, probably 99% of the bridges get overtopped at some point. So that's why it's probably very, very relevant, right? In that, so we also recommend that if you are going to design a new bridge, well, you cannot rely on pier scour protection. There's many people that say, well, I didn't compute the scour because I'm going to protect it. In Australia, that's not allowed. You cannot. And in the same token, if you are to protect an abutment, you need to actually make sure that all the way to SLS, which is equivalent, let's say, for the 1 in 100 event, you can that protection can be relied. But if you have any other event, effectively you're allowed to not rely on it. But the bridge gotta still have to still stand after that event. So that's, I guess, an insight, a really small insight of what we do in Australia. So if you are curious about it, you can go to that website. Download it. It's completely free. It has on the Australian government, so you can have a taste. And I think I will stop it there, Craig.
All right, thanks so much. And I think, as all of the attendees have seen, there's a ton of information that we can cover here. We try to pack as much as we can into these free webinars. But if you want to take a more systematic approach and do this yourself and get the content where you can work on it in between with your workshops, view the online material that Scott and others have put together. Scott Casey, let's go ahead and have you come back on, and let's just have it'll be a bit of a brief panel discussion, but we do want to make sure that we've addressed a few of these questions in the background. And so I guess the first question coming back up it would be on the for the two-flow users, essentially, and any other model that's out there in 2D. Anything, Scott, back to you first, anything that you would recommend in taking any of these 2D approaches in terms of getting your average velocities across that cross section? That seems to be the most upvoted question that's come up here, is how do we take these 2D results and put them back into a system that's been developed for 1D models?
I get, yeah, that's probably why we highlight this point so much, is that this original research and the way it's been applied to date has been using 1D models. And I can say we haven't had much time to talk about this, but we're doing additional research that will more directly utilize 2D data. But until that's out, we're limited to the current methods. So yeah, to be consistent with the original research, we have to utilize or find ways to extract these averaged parameters from the 2D models to use within our current confines of the HEC-18 5th edition scour methods. I'll have to defer to Stan. I could probably tell you the ways I've used HEC-RAS 2D to compute scour, but Stan would probably tell me I'm wrong. I mean, right now there's not a direct tool, and I think it's kind of a free-for-all what users are doing, and that's why we have to bring this really to attention.
Yeah, Stanford, maybe you just want to mention something about the grid sizes. So when everything was a uniform grid size, it's easy to average. When we start, zooming in and having piers that are at, half a meter grid computational cell size, and then in between we go larger and larger, and up in the floodplains we might be even bigger. Any pitfalls you want to talk about in terms of just taking values across a cross section and sticking it into Excel and taking an average? Anything you want to mention about that?
Well, let me just say that version 6.5, which came out a couple of weeks ago, includes reference lines, which are different than profile lines, even though that sounds weird. Profile lines, you go and you draw and you kind of get a pretty picture. Reference lines actually are part of the geometry, and we compute velocities and depths to them, as well as flows and sediment fluxes. If it's a sediment model, it's a much better averaging feature. And so we're moving in that direction to get better one-dimensionalized results. The reference lines are the way to go. We also do reference areas. I saw that Scott was talking about, averaging over an area. We do that. We added it mainly for sediment because areas matter a lot more for sediment, but you can do velocities and depths. So we're kind of building the infrastructure in order to have this conversation with Federal Highway about, how we can join the game. But it's the other thing I would say is, because of our subgrid, You know, the subgrid bathymetry, if you don't know what that means and you're a RAS user, you need to learn what that means, go watch one of our videos. We basically have little cross sections at the face of every cell. So we actually are quasi one-dimensionalized anyways, and you want to cut your lines along the subgrid bathymetry, because then you've already got a cross section basically, and you want to set up your break lines so that your break lines and your reference lines will be the same. Then it's basically a 1D cross section in your 2D model anyways.
Great. And a lot of these
I'll
things.
do a video on that later.
All right. And we look forward to that. And like I said, we'll bring you on for a full dedicated webinar once you're ready to go with any of those. But all these concepts, you know, we've got a lot of TwoFlow users on as well today, and happy to interact, you know, going forward and present anything in this course also coming up where we can really cater to those extracting results out of TwoFlow. But all those warnings will still hold. Casey, let's give Carlos a chance to look at some of the questions that have come in the meantime since his presentation. We'll run for another 5-10 minutes here. Those who need to go, do fill out the polls in that you'll be able to use to help steer our content going forward. For those who are still with us, let's have a couple more discussion items. So Casey, if you can maybe just highlight some of the questions that you've answered. You've been frantically typing away here, and just let us know what you think is the most bang for your buck commentary you can make for those who have been asking questions.
Yeah, I think, you know, one thing to take away is that Scour is not, it's very interdisciplinary, right? You've got to be working with your fluvial geomorphologists, you've got to be working with your geotechnical engineers, you've got to be working with your structural engineers, because it's so interdisciplinary. And I think that's what makes it so fascinating. And so I think a lot of these questions are around that very point. One question was, you know, talking about how do you know, one of the questions was, you know, how do you know if your bridge is prone to failure due to Scour? And so it's utilizing your hydraulic results, it's utilizing the equations in HEC-18 or equivalent manuals of wherever you are from, and, you know, following these methods that we've presented today to really assess that potential for Scour, both for new bridges and existing bridges. I think another, you know, on that topic, the topic of D50s and sediment has definitely come up quite a bit. There was a question in here, you know, about a lot of the equations that do utilize a D50. There's a lot of equations that actually don't even utilize a D50. You know, the Scour is actually independent of the sediment grain size, which, you know, is a limitation we have. But for the ones that you can utilize a D50, if you are getting stratigraphy information from your geotechnical engineer, you know, understanding how that changes with depth, and if the Scour that you are computing was within a different size range, you should be assessing that different size range. And I know, Scott, do you want to just, you talked about it really briefly, I think, but it's important. I think, you know, with the Scour decay function, do you want to touch on that and maybe some of the things coming out in the relation to the varying sediment size?
Yeah, briefly, it's a shear decay function, and it will be based more for non-cohesive material. It will be based more on the gradation, primarily D50 of the material. And I think the key here too, and some people in the comments have noted that Scour is currently additive with regards to computing contraction Scour and then adding pier Scour for the fixed channel bed hydraulics. That is how it is. Without getting into that too much, you know, to be able to have to recompute hydraulics after, you know, modifying the mesh for contracted Scour conditions and computing pier Scour would be a lot of work. We don't currently do that. It would be acceptable. There's a lot more to that picture though. But for the shear decay function, we're going to be utilizing both contraction pier Scour and abutment Scour, looking at how, as Scour occurs, that shear is decreasing farther and farther within the Scour hole. And we're going to be looking at that in conjunction with pier Scour and abutment Scour. So that is going to be more directly dependent on 2D model results and much less on these average values. So I mean, we are moving in that direction without giving too much details. Stay tuned for the 6th edition of HEC-18, which has still got more than a year to come. Maybe, I don't want to say try to be too predictive. It's got a little ways to go, but it's heading in the right direction.
All right. Well, when it's out, let's do a special dedicated webinar just on that and what's new. So that, we're talking about a lot of disciplines involve dirt, a lot of disciplines involve water. We've got this nexus of how water moves dirt, and it's a specialized field. And what I can see in the background, thanks so much. There's a lot of experts on board here who have actually been contributing to these comments as well, in addition to the panelists that you see here. So thanks for that, Carlos. The same question over to you. Just if you wanted to select one or two questions that you have addressed in the background. Those who watch the YouTube recording won't see these. You'll need to click on the link in the bottom if you want to see the actual Q&A that has been going on in the background this entire time that we've been talking. Many questions, some of them still open. Carlos, maybe just pick one or two that you wanted to highlight, and then we'll wrap it up in the next couple
so
of minutes.
I guess one of the questions has been asked is, well, how do I choose where, or how if I have a 2D model, how do I actually get to know my velocities or my contractions? And so unfortunately, there's not a guideline, that exact guideline. There's a lot of engineering judgment based on different parameters. The way I do it, and once again, that might be completely wrong for other persons, is that I actually look at the unit discharges. And I see how do they fluctuate in the 2D model domain, and with that and the vectors kind of allows me to determine if there's actually real contraction happening. So and based on that, then you can actually go and select your cross sections upstream on that, upstream of the bridge, and then it becomes the topic of the average or point velocities that you are going to use for your Scour calculation. Sometimes I use average, sometimes I do sensitivity analysis and I go with the points. So there's a little bit of engineering judgment, but I think just by getting familiar with your 2D, with the patterns that are happening at your contraction, you will be able to actually visualize much better what is happening. So that's, I guess, one of the questions I want to make. Yeah, definitely. So
that's quite one of the main questions people came to this webinar to hear the answers to, and you may be disappointed that it's not a simple answer, but come along. We've got 3 sessions where, and in between each session, we've got at least 4 hours of material that's online viewing for you to actually do this yourself and really get familiar with it. All right, closing remarks for everybody else. Let's go Stanford, Scott, and then Casey. Let's just bring it home with some closing remarks for you. For Stanford, anything you got to say?
No, great material. Thanks, everyone.
Sounds good. Scott, closing remarks.
The only thing is, I think just anybody computing Scour, just take the time to dig into it, invest in what you need for the input data. It's not a black box. And that's, we just run into too many people. I've got hydraulics, I've got a hydraulic toolbox, I plug in the values, I get something out, I can go. It's more than that. Take the time to invest and understand the input data.
All right, and free resources available to you. Casey's been with us 3 times before. Full hour of excellent material for riprap and scour countermeasures and a previous bridge scour webinar that was a little more basic than we've got. So Casey, anything you want to sum up before we see you again in June at the course?
Rivers are dynamic. Just look at Google, utilize aerial imagery and talk to your maintenance folks, talk to, just understand rivers dynamic, and don't always take those 2D model results or 1D model results or even 3D model results, use them with a grain of salt because things change. So just keep that in mind when you're going through the analysis.
All right. And that's a cross plug. Yeah, thanks. That's a cross plug for our other webinars. Do join us and register for some of these AI webinars coming up. We've got one that we just finished on segmentation, got another one with GPT coming up, and it is an exciting field. And we've got some tools for you where you can go in and select an area and on all the satellite imagery going back to the 1980s, watch what happens to these rivers. It's amazingly informative for any project out there to just be able to see how dynamic some of these systems are, or possibly some of them haven't moved in 100 years or since they've had satellite photos. That's good information if you know what flood events have occurred in the meantime. So do join us for some of those as well. Lots of resources for you. Let us know what else you want to hear more of. Thanks so much to the presenters and panelists for being with us today. We look forward to further interaction with you, the attendees, throughout the rest of this year and in the future for our content on the Australian Water School. Thanks. We'll see you next time.